The morning sun cast long shadows across the firing range at Fort Carson, Colorado. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood at attention, her boots perfectly aligned, her uniform crisp despite the early hour. She was 32 years old, a veteran of 2 tours overseas, and today she was about to present the most important research of her military career. Around her, a dozen male officers gathered, their faces showing varying degrees of skepticism. Sarah had seen that look before. In her 12 years of service, she had grown accustomed to being the only woman in the room, the one they assumed was there to take notes rather than lead the briefing. "Gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and clear, "what I'm about to show you could change the way our soldiers engage targets in combat. It could save lives." Colonel Hammond, a barrel-chested man with silver hair and a permanent scowl, crossed his arms. "Lieutenant Mitchell, we've been training soldiers to aim for over 200 years. What makes you think you've discovered something we've all missed?" Sarah had expected this. She clicked to the first slide of her presentation, which showed ballistic data from hundreds of combat engagements. "Because I looked at what actually happens in battles, sir, not what we think happens on a clean firing range." She explained her findings methodically. For the past 18 months, Sarah had been analyzing combat footage, interviewing soldiers, and studying the physics of target engagement under stress. What she discovered challenged everything the military had taught for generations. Traditional marksmanship training told soldiers to aim directly at the center of their target. But Sarah's research showed that under combat stress, with adrenaline flooding their systems and fear clouding their judgment, soldiers consistently shot high. Their bullets sailed over enemy heads, missing by mere inches, but missing nonetheless. "So you're saying our soldiers can't shoot straight?" Lieutenant Barnes interrupted, his tone dripping with condescension. Several of the other officers chuckled. Sarah's jaw tightened, but she kept her voice level. "I'm saying that under combat conditions, the human body responds in predictable ways. Heart rate increases, fine motor control decreases, and visual focus narrows. These aren't weaknesses. They're biological facts." She clicked to her next slide, showing the revolutionary solution she had developed. Instead of aiming at the center of the target, she proposed that soldiers be trained to aim at a point behind and below their target. This behind-the-target method compensated for the natural tendency to pull shots high. "When you're being shot at," Sarah continued, "your body floods with adrenaline. Your muscles tense. You tend to jerk the trigger and lift the muzzle slightly just before firing. By training soldiers to aim behind the target, we account for these involuntary movements. The result is that the bullet travels exactly where it needs to go." Colonel Hammond stood up, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "This is ridiculous. You want us to tell our soldiers to aim at thin air, to ignore everything they've learned?" "I want us to teach them to hit what they're aiming at," Sarah replied firmly. "With all due respect, Lieutenant," said Captain Morrison, a weapons training instructor with 20 years of experience, "this sounds like theory from someone who's spent too much time with computers and not enough time on the battlefield." The words stung because they were designed to. Sarah had spent 2 tours in Afghanistan, had earned a Bronze Star for valor, had seen friends die beside her, but she had also earned a master's degree in biomechanics, had spent countless hours analyzing data, and had developed a method that could genuinely save lives. "I've prepared a demonstration," Sarah said quietly. "If you'll follow me to the range." The officers exchanged glances, some rolling their eyes. But they followed her outside to where she had set up a series of human-shaped targets at combat distances. She had also assembled 2 groups of junior soldiers, none of whom had been told the purpose of the exercise. The first group fired using traditional methods, aiming at the center mass of the targets. Their accuracy was respectable, about 40% hits under simulated stress conditions where loud noises and timed pressure mimicked combat. Then Sarah took the second group aside. She spent 20 minutes teaching them her method, explaining the concept of aiming behind the target, showing them exactly where to focus their eyes and how to anticipate their body's stress response. When this group fired, the difference was remarkable. Their hit rate jumped to over 75%. Target after target fell with precise shots to center mass, even though the soldiers had been aiming at points that seemed counterintuitive. The officers watched in stunned silence. Then Colonel Hammond spoke, his voice hard. "It's a trick. You picked better shooters for the second group." "The groups were randomly assigned, sir," Sarah responded. "I can provide the documentation." Then the first group was told to miss. "You staged this." Sarah felt anger rising in her chest, but she forced it down. "Sir, you're welcome to select soldiers yourself and run the test again." "I'm confident in the results." Colonel Hammond's face reddened. "What I'm confident in, Lieutenant, is that you've wasted our time with parlor tricks and junk science. This meeting is over." As the officers filed away, their dismissive comments floating back to her on the morning breeze, Sarah stood alone on the firing range. She looked at the targets, at the clear evidence of her method's success, and felt the familiar weight of being right, but ignored. Captain Morrison paused as he walked past. "You know what your problem is, Mitchell? You think being smart makes you special? But in the real military and actual combat, it's experience that matters. And you're just not experienced enough to know what you don't know." He walked away, leaving Sarah standing in the dust with her research, her data, and her determination. She had been underestimated before. She had been dismissed, mocked, and insulted. But she had never quit, and she wasn't about to start now. 3 months passed, and Sarah's report gathered dust in a filing cabinet somewhere in the Pentagon. She returned to her regular duties as a training officer, watching young soldiers learn the traditional methods that she knew would fail them when they needed accuracy most. But Sarah couldn't let it go. Every night after her official duties ended, she continued her research. She refined her training methods, gathered more data, and documented everything with scientific precision. She also began teaching her technique, quietly to small groups of soldiers who sought her out, men and women who had heard rumors about her demonstration and wanted to learn. The results were consistent. Every soldier who learned the behind-the-target method showed dramatic improvement in stress-fire situations. Word began to spread through the enlisted ranks, even as the officer corps continued to ignore her. Then Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb came to see her. He was a combat veteran preparing for his 3rd deployment to Afghanistan. He had a wife and 2 young daughters, and he was terrified of not coming home to them. "Ma'am," he said, standing awkwardly in her office doorway, "I heard you got a way to help us shoot better in combat. Real combat, not range time." Sarah invited him in and spent 2 hours teaching him her method. Marcus was a quick study, dedicated and focused. Before he deployed, his accuracy under stress conditions had improved by nearly 60%. 4 months later, Sarah received a letter from Afghanistan. It was from Marcus. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he wrote in careful handwriting, "I'm alive because of what you taught me. Last week, our patrol was ambushed in a valley. I had 3 seconds to engage multiple targets at distance. Using your method, I hit every single one. My buddies are calling it luck, but I know the truth. You saved my life and the lives of my team. Whatever they say about you back at Carson, know that you're a hero to us out here." The letter made Sarah cry, but it also hardened her resolve. She wasn't doing this for recognition or promotion. She was doing it because it worked, because it saved lives, and because it was right. She decided to try one more time to get official approval. She requested a meeting with General Patricia Dawson, the highest-ranking female officer at Fort Carson, and a woman known for her fair-mindedness. General Dawson reviewed Sarah's data with the careful attention of someone who understood both military protocol and scientific method. She watched videos of the training sessions, studied the statistics, and asked pointed questions. "This is impressive work, Lieutenant," the general said finally. "But you must understand the resistance you're facing. You're asking the military to admit that it's been training soldiers incorrectly for generations. That's not just about ego. It's about liability, about second-guessing decisions that led to casualties, about opening doors we'd rather keep closed. But if it saves lives going forward," Sarah began. "I know," General Dawson interrupted gently. "And I agree with you. But I need you to understand what you're up against. This isn't just about proving your method works. It's about changing an institution that moves slowly and carefully." The general paused, then made a decision. I'm going to recommend a larger-scale test. We'll run it through the infantry school at Fort Benning. If your results hold with a bigger sample size, under more rigorous conditions, then we'll have something we can take to the Joint Chiefs. For the first time in months, Sarah felt hope rising in her chest. Thank you, General. Don't thank me yet, Dawson replied. This kind of change makes enemies, and you've already made several. Colonel Hammond has been quite vocal about his opinion of your research. He's called it everything from pseudoscience to feminist propaganda. Sarah's hands clenched into fists. My research has nothing to do with gender, ma'am. It's about physics and human physiology. You and I know that, the general said. But Hammond doesn't see it that way. He sees a woman challenging the old guard, and that threatens him. Be careful, Lieutenant. Sometimes being right isn't enough. The test at Fort Benning was scheduled for 3 months later. Sarah threw herself into preparation, refining her training program and gathering even more supporting data. She barely slept, driven by the knowledge that this might be her only chance to prove her method on a large scale. 2 weeks before the test, she was called into Colonel Hammond's office. He sat behind his desk, his expression grim. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said without preamble, "I'm denying your request to attend the Fort Benning evaluation." Sarah felt the floor drop out from under her. "Sir, this is my research. I need to be there to explain the methodology." "Your methodology will be explained by Captain Morrison," Hammond interrupted. "He's reviewed your materials and will serve as the primary instructor." "Captain Morrison doesn't believe in the method," Sarah protested. "He's openly hostile to it." "Captain Morrison is an experienced combat instructor who will present your ideas fairly," Hammond said. His tone made it clear the decision was final. "You're needed here for other duties. Dismissed, Lieutenant." Sarah left his office feeling sick. She knew what was happening. Morrison would sabotage the demonstration, either through incompetent instruction or deliberate misrepresentation. Her method would fail, not because it didn't work, but because it wouldn't be properly taught. That night, she called General Dawson and explained the situation. The general was sympathetic but pragmatic. "I can't override Hammond's decision without cause," she said. "That would create a chain of command issue. But I can make sure there are observers present who understand what they're looking for." It wasn't enough, but it was something. Sarah had to trust that the truth would be evident even without her there to defend it. The day of the Fort Benning test arrived. Sarah waited at Fort Carson, her phone close, her stomach in knots. Hours passed with no word. Then finally, late in the afternoon, her phone rang. It was General Dawson. Her voice was tight with barely controlled anger. "The test was a disaster," she said. "Morrison taught your method incorrectly, either through incompetence or malice. The results showed no improvement over traditional methods. Colonel Hammond is using this to discredit your entire research program." Sarah closed her eyes. She had known this might happen, but the reality of it was crushing. "What happens now?" "Now we fight back," General Dawson said, steel in her voice. "Because I had observers there who documented everything. Morrison's instruction deviated from your written materials in at least a dozen critical ways. This wasn't a fair test, and I'm prepared to prove it. The investigation that followed was brutal." Sarah found herself defending not just her research, but her integrity, her competence, and her right to be taken seriously. Colonel Hammond filed a formal complaint alleging that she had wasted military resources on pseudoscience. Captain Morrison claimed she had falsified her original data. Sarah stood firm, providing documentation for every claim, evidence for every conclusion. She had been meticulous in her research precisely because she had known she would be doubted. Now that caution paid off. General Dawson fought beside her, using her rank and reputation to demand a fair hearing. Together, they assembled a panel of independent experts, military historians, biomechanics specialists, and combat veterans who had used Sarah's method in the field. The turning point came when Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb returned from Afghanistan and requested permission to testify. He brought with him 15 other soldiers from his unit, all of whom had learned Sarah's method and all of whom credited it with saving their lives in combat. "I don't know about physics or science," Marcus said at the hearing, his voice rough with emotion. "I just know that what Lieutenant Mitchell taught me worked when nothing else had. In 12 years of military service, I'd never been able to hit consistently under fire. After 2 hours with her, I could. That's not pseudoscience. That's the difference between coming home to my daughters and dying in a foreign desert." One by one, the soldiers testified. They described firefights where split-second accuracy meant survival. They talked about targets engaged at distances that should have been impossible. They showed the panel combat footage where the behind-the-target method had resulted in precise shots under conditions of extreme stress. Colonel Hammond tried to argue that these were isolated incidents, that the plural of anecdote wasn't data, but the evidence was overwhelming. Sarah's method worked, and it worked consistently. The panel's conclusion was unanimous. Sarah's research was sound, her methodology was revolutionary, and her training program should be implemented across all branches of the military. But the vindication came with an unexpected twist. General Dawson called Sarah into her office 3 days after the panel's recommendation was announced. "Sit down, Lieutenant," she said. "We need to talk about your future." Sarah sat, uncertain what was coming. "The Army wants to promote you to captain and put you in charge of a new marksmanship training program at Fort Benning," the general said. "You'll completely redesign how we teach soldiers to shoot. It's a remarkable opportunity." Sarah waited. She could hear the "but" coming. "But," General Dawson continued, "there's a catch. Colonel Hammond has powerful friends at the Pentagon. They're embarrassed by this situation, and they're looking for a way to save face. They've proposed that Captain Morrison be assigned as your deputy and receive co-credit for developing the training method." The injustice of it took Sarah's breath away. The man who tried to sabotage my research would get credit for it? "Half credit," the general said quietly. "And you would be required to publicly state that his contribution was significant and valuable." Sarah stood and walked to the window. She looked out at the parade ground where young soldiers were drilling, learning skills that might one day save their lives. She thought about Marcus and his daughters. She thought about all the soldiers who would deploy in the years to come. "No," she said finally. "I won't do it." General Dawson leaned forward. "Sarah, think carefully. This is your chance to implement your method, to save lives on a massive scale. At the cost of legitimizing what Hammond and Morrison did?" Sarah turned to face her. "At the cost of teaching young officers that sabotage and sexism are acceptable if you have the right connections? Sometimes we have to compromise to achieve the greater good." "Not this time," Sarah said firmly. "I have another option." She explained what she had been working on privately. Several defense contractors had approached her about developing her training method for civilian law enforcement and private sector use. She could leave the military, work independently, and still get her method out into the world. It wouldn't have the same reach as a military-wide program, but it would be on her own terms. General Dawson was quiet for a long moment. Then she smiled. "You know what? I think there might be a third option you haven't considered." Over the next 2 weeks, General Dawson worked her contacts at the highest levels of the Pentagon. She made it clear that if the Army forced Sarah to share credit with Morrison, she would resign her commission in protest and take the story to the media. She pointed out that in an era when the military was struggling to recruit and retain talented women, punishing a female officer for being right was terrible optics. Most importantly, she got the story to the Secretary of Defense, a former infantry officer who read Sarah's research personally and was impressed by both its rigor and its results. The final decision came down from the very top. Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell would be promoted to captain and given complete control of the new marksmanship training program. Captain Morrison would be reassigned to a desk job at a remote base in Alaska, and Colonel Hammond would be given the opportunity to retire early with full honors, rather than face a formal investigation into his conduct. On the day Sarah pinned on her captain's bars, General Dawson was there. So was Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb and 14 of his fellow soldiers. They had traveled from Afghanistan on leave specifically to attend the ceremony. "You did it," the general said quietly as they stood together afterward. "You changed the military." Sarah looked at the soldiers around her, men and women who would carry her method into combat, who would teach it to others, who would come home to their families because of science and determination and the refusal to quit. "No," she said. "We did it together." 6 months later, the behind-the-target aiming method was standard training across all U.S. military branches. Combat accuracy rates doubled, exactly as Sarah's research had predicted. Casualty rates among American forces dropped significantly. Sarah never sought publicity. She gave lectures at military academies and training facilities, teaching her method to instructors who would teach thousands of others. She refined the technique, adapted it for different weapons and situations, and continued her research into how human performance could be optimized under stress. Years later, when a military journalist asked her about the discrimination and obstacles she had faced, Sarah gave an answer that became famous in military circles. "They told me I wasn't experienced enough to know what I didn't know," she said. "But experience without curiosity is just repetition. I was curious about why soldiers were missing shots in combat. I looked for the answer. And when I found it, I refused to let anyone convince me to ignore the truth. That's not a female trait or a male trait. That's what every good soldier should do." The story of Sarah Mitchell's behind-the-target method became a case study at military academies, taught not just as a lesson in marksmanship but as an example of how innovation happens. It showed how challenging established doctrine, even when you're the most junior person in the room, can save lives. And somewhere in Colorado, a woman named Sarah taught young soldiers to aim true, knowing that every lesson she gave was a soldier who would come home, a family that would stay whole, and proof that being underestimated just means they won't see you coming until it's too late to stop the truth.